Koto katoa, let's begin. Well, this is probably our last seminar for the year. Am I correct in that, Marie? Oh, okay. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Richard Reid. I'm Philippa Harden-Chapman, and Richard's had a long interest in the work that we've been doing in the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities and has talked at a number of our conferences. But this is the first time he's done a Friday seminar, so it's great to hear you speak more at length. He's an architect, a landscape architect, an urban designer, and a transport planner with 30 years professional experience. He's worked nationally and internationally, recognised design practices in Sydney and London, and has made significant contributions to public projects in New Zealand. He specialises in integrating large-scale infrastructure, urban and landscape projects with local environments and communities. The practice's track record includes creating alternative designs for 6 nationally important transport infrastructure projects, and we had many discussions about the Basin Reserve, all of which have been preferred, adopted and or implemented, including a transport plan for Buckle Street in Wellington, which enabled the creation of the State Highway 1, Puketāpapa National War Memorial Park above it, and an upgrade alternative to the Basin Reserve flyover, which was preferred by a board of inquiry in 2014. He's currently playing a formative role in major urban master planning projects, and he made a significant contribution to the protection and enhancement of nationally important landscapes, including successfully preventing destructive development of 5 Auckland volcanoes. And it's on this topic that he's going to talk to us today. Look forward to what you have to say, Richard. And Richard's going to talk for half an hour, which will leave us for a quarter of an hour questions.
Thank you, Philippa. Okay, so the thesis for my talk today is this. The high-level interest shown by government in the spatial planning of special urban development areas is principally to ensure that New Zealand addresses its severe housing shortages in high-growth cities. The government should use the strategic value of this decision to also improve the resilience, health, and social capital of these communities, including existing suburbs under consideration for significant regeneration. I will illustrate 2 plans for 1 potential special urban development area, the Three Kings suburb of Auckland. One of these is by Fletcher Residential and the other is by my practice. I will start by providing some historical context to the suburb because understanding how a place was formed and is organised is critical for creating a more resilient community. I'll then follow this with a brief outline of the Fletcher proposal and then illustrate my alternative. Our focus has been to create a high-quality built environment for residents where the urban design, architecture, landscape and the design of the public realm are integrated with goals for social and environmental sustainability. We take a whole systems approach in a similar way to Harrison Fracker, who spoke recently here, where the social capital and cohesion of a community is enriched by and positively interacts with its sustainable urban form and environment. The ultimate aim is to achieve well-being for the whole suburb. So firstly, some history and so we're not giving that to... There we go, it's very slow. Okay, so this is a drawing of the Auckland volcanic field, which underlies the city of Auckland. It was drawn by Ferdinand von Hochstetter, an Austrian-German geologist in 1859. Hochstetter declared Auckland to be one of the most remarkable volcanic districts of the earth. The field, which is still active, contains 51 volcanoes within a 20-kilometre radius, with the eruptions creating scoria cones, lava flows, explosion craters, and tuff rings. Since Hofstede's survey, only 2 volcanic cones have been left untouched by quarrying, with many completely quarried away or substantially modified. This is the story of one of the quarried volcanoes, Three Kings, which Māori know as Te Tatua Riukiuta. After Riukiuta, a navigator and tūhonga on the Tainui Waka, who lived and brought his people together on the volcano about 600 years ago. And here is Three Kings here. Although Three Kings presumes 3 distinctive features, it was Auckland's largest and most complex volcano. Here we see it adjacent to Maunga Kia, One Tree Hill, and Mongafo Mount Eden volcano. The initial eruption created a circular tuff ring 1 kilometre in diameter. There followed further eruptions forming 5 major scoria cones and a dozen smaller scoria mounds. These sat within the tuff ring like eggs within inside a nest. Molten lava filled around the scoria cones and then overflowed the tuff ring in the northwestern corner. Here's a photo from 1920 looking from the wall of the tuff ring towards 3 of the 5 scoria cones, with Big King on the right-hand side of the image. We have a series of smaller mounds in the foreground, and around us is the wall of the tuff ring, which circumnavigates the whole of those scoria cones round to the northwest. And the level ground is the lava lake formed by the molten lava, which then overflowed out towards the east. The local area of Three Kings is strongly defined by the volcano, including the historic arrangement of streets. As early as 1860, a city plan showed 4 boundary roads forming a near-perfect square frame centred on and around the cluster of scoria cones. Now, a square frame is a highly unusual typology in Auckland's early and ongoing city planning. It demonstrates a high-level planning order was overlaid on the volcanic complex, which accommodated its distinctive size and features. The 1860 map also showed a major road alignment aligned on the centre of Te Tatua Riukiuta towards Mongafo volcano, creating a grand landscape and urban axis between the 2 volcanoes. No 2 other volcanoes were embedded in the city plan in this way. And here we can see a view from Big King looking towards Mongafo with Mount Eden Road, that grand axis heading off towards it. The scale of this order is usually seen in the planning of imperial cities such as Beijing, which are planned to align a divine organisation of human settlement with an auspicious landscape, typically mountains. And it's interesting to learn that the centre of Beijing was actually a man-made mountain, Long Life Mountain, not the seat of the emperor. These cities also have a rich hierarchy of spatial definition from their centre outwards, which is articulated by a series of nested structures. So we have the seat of the emperor inside the courtyard, inside the compound, inside the Forbidden City, inside the inner city, and so on. So the streets inside the square frame at Three Kings also reflect this radial pattern. The streets on the western side, which is immediately in the foreground, took their line from the volcano's features, fitting between or around the cones, the crusted edge of the lava lake, which is, going forward, which is here, and the walls of the Tuffering, which are here. Looking closer at the western side's radial street pattern, we see new state housing being introduced to the suburb in the 1940s, with a mixture of 1- and 2-storied duplexes. What's distinctive about the arrangement for me is the narrow plot divisions for each property, which you can see in the area between the houses on the wall or the slope of the Tuffering itself. I'm not aware of any volcano in Auckland which has been subdivided in this way. Note also the use or the potential use of this slope for food production. We can see the power of the divine order of Three Kings in this view, with the volcano sitting at the head of the grand axis. We can also see the large-scale quarrying of the scoria cones for roading material. This began as early as the 1840s and significantly upscaled in the 1950s. At the same time as the city plan was consolidating the position of the volcano, its presence was being quarried away. Seen today, 4 of the scoria cones and all of the scoria mounds have disappeared. So too have been lost almost all of the earthwork, stone walls, pa, middens and urapa associated with Maori occupation. Only Big King is left, which is here. Now Te Tatua Riukiuta chiefly refers to this one remaining cone. While the circularity of the Tuffering is still strongly embedded in the suburb, the centrality of the volcano has been replaced by the scale, shape, and depth of Three Kings Quarry. And just to point out a few other features that we'll come to later in the talk, this is the town centre, which is privately owned, and there are a lot of Housing New Zealand properties in this area, part of which I showed you before. And here we have a view looking deep inside the quarry towards Big King. And to point out, there's the highest point of the Tuffering in the distance, and we've got Western Park and the Southern Reserve here, which are historical quarries by the local board, rather than by Winstons or Fletchers who have quarried this area here. The town centre is on the higher level up here, and also I'd like to just bring your attention to this bridge, what I call a landscape bridge, which connects Big King with bluffs or remnants of the volcanic cones that were quarried away. So in 2011, the Environment Court granted Fletcher the right to clean fill the quarry. Fletcher and the community agreed to the new fill levels, which were close to adjoining ground levels, and remedied the worst effects from quarrying, including covering over the quarry access road. So if I just come back and show you, here's the quarry access road here. So the levels almost met adjoining ground levels and covered over the worst effects of the quarrying. In 2014, Fletcher applied to rezone the quarry for residential development. However, Fletcher's master plan left the quarry 15 to 17 metres below street level. Fletcher believed the lower fill level would increase the number of houses and shorten the lead-in time for construction. The significant change in final fill level conflicted with the expectations of the local community and the local board, Puketāpapa Local Board, who presumed it would be to their 2011 levels. The lower fill level fundamentally affects the development's ability to integrate with its surroundings, as well as provide easy access and a walkable neighbourhood. Further excavations are needed to enable access to the floor of the quarry. So that bridge that I was talking to you about has been quarried away to allow an access road down into the floor of the quarry. So that bridge that connected Big King with the rest of the volcanic landscape has been lost, and now Big King is a standalone feature. So Fletcher's approach to residential development was to develop come up with a typology called cascading apartment typology, which it considers an innovative use of the quarry. And what they've done here is they've got the existing quarry walls, they've cut that back close to the property boundaries, and then provided 5 to 6 stories of car parking, and with ramps and connecting one building, car parking building, to another and another, and then sleeving that very large car parking building with one side of apartments. And then on top of the car parking building, providing another 4 stories. So you've got a 9 to 10 story building, of which 6 to 7 floors have only got apartments on one side. And that halves the potential number of units from each of these buildings. And in my opinion, that's a very inefficient arrangement. And as well as that, the cost of the massive car parking structures are added to the price of each apartment unit. So when we look at the master plan, we can see these buildings, 10 of them, around the edges of the quarry, stretching for 750 metres, with that's 9 to 10 stories, with a 5-story building here. So you've got this sort of monumental wall circumnavigating nearly 1 kilometre in length. There are very few visual gaps between them, and only 2 main pedestrian access points, here and here, over 400 metres apart. On the floor are 3-storied terrace houses and 5-storied apartment buildings, these of which turn their back on Big King. And there's what I call a circuitous suburban street pattern, which creates a lot of road in use instead of potential building. And the open space here provides 2 playing fields and very little other usable open space. Here's a drawing, an axonometric drawing showing looking towards Big King, and we can see those large apartment buildings around the edges, looking towards the playing fields and the housing on the floor. So the lower fill level, the limited entry points, the circuitous roading, and the wall effect of the apartment buildings isolates the development from the town centre and the neighbourhood, effectively creating a gated community within. And Big King, you can see, is left as a background feature outside the development, contributing little of its character and identity. Perhaps most important, and most importantly of all, this development will not be able to change or be retrofitted over time. the physical constraints of the whole, the inefficiencies of the planning and design, and the energy required to service and inhabit the development are locked in permanently. Fletcher also applied for and was granted approval to use 6.5 hectares of the Three Kings Reserve in the development. The public land exchange meant that a public good outcome for the community became integral to the development. And in essence, if this was only about Fletcher's land, that would be a very different involvement from the community than the fact that public land has been brought into the development. So we can see the Three Kings Reserve is the green area here. And it's not visible from the plan, but this level here is much lower than the town centre and another part of the reserve here. It's about 17 metres below level, and Western Park is about 8 metres below this level. And the question raised by the council is what is the land use proposed by Fletcher an acceptable outcome? And you can see most of that reserve has been divided up by housing and by roading, and extra land has been provided within the Fletcher development in order to create the two playing fields. So amongst many reasons given against the land exchange, the local board argued that Fletcher and council did not adequately consider alternative options for how the public open space could be improved. So where the level difference seemed to be a fundamental limitation of Three Kings Reserve, is there another way of actually improving the outcome for the reserve rather than building residential apartments? So the local community and the local board were not satisfied with the proposal because of its poor connectivity with the neighbourhood, its failure to rehabilitate the volcanic landscape, and its lack of equity. The community and the local board opposed Fletcher's plan, which ultimately led to another Environment Court process in 2015. Yes, what concerned the local board the most was that it had already prepared a 30-year strategic guide for development of the suburb, which was based on the quarry being filled to street level. The Three Kings plan had been developed in partnership with mana whenua, the community and major landowners in the area, including Fletcher. Two community groups, followed by the local board, engaged my practice to develop an alternative to Fletcher's master plan based upon the Three Kings plan. So looking at the overall suburb, their focus was on the well-being of that overall suburb, not solely Fletcher's land. And it identified 5 key moves that the community wanted to see happen. First of all, was to recognise and restore the mana of Big King and enhance the open space network. Secondly, was to revitalise that privately owned town centre. Is that 5 minutes to go? Okay. Encourage high quality residential development, improve connections between people and places, and develop a sense of local character around Big King. So when I looked at this project, I looked at what were the fundamental limitations and started to see if I could improve those. And the key problem in this whole suburb was the disconnect between the western side of Big King and the western side of Three Kings and the eastern side. And there's no connection here whatsoever. So the first thing that we did was to make that connection, which would benefit, in particular, walking and cycling. And then this street connection is extended into the Fletcher property, and connecting with the local neighbourhood street pattern. Now the radial road acts as a spine for development on Fletcher's land using a conventional perimeter block typology. And then when we develop the town centre, we get, in essence, a new vision for the whole suburb. And then when we translate that into an overall master plan, we can see that that new streetwork enables compact living and efficient moving around Big King, but it also significantly improves the networking of the suburb and the social capital of the community. And the rest of the land can be used for green infrastructure and to further benefit the community. And that's what that area looks like. It provides a generous setting for Big King and the recreational needs of the community. Eco services can be incorporated: stormwater management, wastewater management, food production, habitat creation. When we look at other examples in Auckland, we can see that the provision of recreational open space against volcanic landscapes are very, very successful. You get this very strong interface where there's a complementary relationship between the two. Conceptually, we saw that open space against Big King as a series of terraces that connect with the surrounding topography. Two key things to note: we lifted the area of the Southern Reserve by 8 metres to bring it closer to the other levels and retained it as public space. And we also covered over the quarry access road. And we can see an example in the Auckland domain where that kind of softened contouring creates a very gentle landscape, easily navigated by young children as well as adults. So these higher fill levels dissolve those historical barriers created by the quarrying. All the land is joined together and is continuous. So you get a much more resilient community as a result. The fill level the amount of fill in our design is less than in 2011. However, it's obviously more than Fletcher's, about 1 year and 10 months longer required to fill it to our levels based upon reasonable filling rates. However, the Environment Court process lifted Fletcher's ground levels, so that difference isn't so great. Here we're looking from the town centre towards the playing fields. So here's that overall master plan, where we can see now the buildings, apartment buildings that we've provided, a compact, medium density, mixed use, walkable neighbourhoods. Those buildings in brown, which are all on Fletcher's land, are only 4 to 5 stories high. And then we've redeveloped the town centre separately, but we've brought them all together as one plan. And you can see with the buildings here, car parking in the basements, and just this very strong interface between the buildings to Big King, and creating a topography or a townscape with these buildings so that the buildings reflect the volcanic landscape rather than being independent. When we look at the zoning for the two areas, this is my area here in orange, which is apartment buildings and terrace houses, and that's the extent of residential building on the Fletcher land. So there's our area is about 1/3 of the total plan change area and about half of Fletcher's land that we need for development. So what does this translate, just a couple of slides left, what does this translate in terms of numbers? Well, what we found is that we're getting the same numbers of housing units as Fletcher's has before it entered the Environment Court. And through that Environment Court process, it's lost something like 170 units through compromises with the local community, which translates to about $100 million in sales. But we're also getting half the building area, we're getting half the roading area compared to Fletcher's, and we're getting nearly double the open space. So there's massive investment in infrastructure for the Fletcher development for much less returns for Fletcher, as well as much less returns or benefits for the community. And when we just look at the roads, laneways and paths, you can see the intensity of movement on their site and the amount of land that is taken up by those roads. And you can see that the zigzagging of these pathways is to negotiate that slope or that drop down into the quarry. Whereas in our design, it's very flexible. The paths aren't formalized. You can travel in any direction and very little infrastructure actually required. So just to finish with, Fletcher, so obviously Fletcher's in the process of trying to recover from losing nearly $1 billion over the past 2 years on big construction projects. These losses have been attributed to poor costing practices and information flows within Fletcher. The overall scale of Fletcher's Three Kings development is actually comparable to other developments which have troubled them and has led to its exit from the vertical construction market. In my opinion, if Fletcher or another developer starts construction of the large apartment buildings against the edge of the quarry, they'll be exposing themselves to huge financial risk. And if even one large apartment building is built, the social, environmental, and economic disbenefits of the development for the local community and the overall suburb will be locked in for all time. However, we are more optimistic that a better outcome may be possible. And so therefore it makes sense to develop the suburb in a collective way where co-benefits can be maximised. And we think the best way to ensure this is for the government to purchase Fletcher's land, incorporate it with its Housing New Zealand land, the Crown-owned reserve, so it's essentially the majority landowner of the suburb, and work with the privately owned town centre to create a special urban development area. And last slide. If then it worked with our plan, it would be able to create, we think, a high quality built environment for this place. And just to return to my beginning, we've taken this whole system approach where the social capital and cohesion of the community is enriched by the urban form and the environment rather than being independent. And we'd like to think that the ultimate goal for the suburb is its well-being. Thank you very much, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation. Questions? And could you please, for the sake of the people who are not on site, but identify yourself by name and where you work, or your interests? Well, maybe I'll ask the first question while people are deciding. Richard, where are you at legally, or where is the government at legally, or the Auckland Council legally?
Well, I have outlined this talk in a paper that you can download from the internet, which is called this, the name of this paper. So what happened out of the Environment Court process is that the court recommended major changes to the Fletcher master plan rather than declining it or recommending our design as an alternative. And the compromises that were sought and achieved were further weakened by the settlement with the community groups in another process, because of another court process, a high court process with the unitary plan. So what has happened is that the community groups and Fletchers have come to an agreement, but it's a very compromised agreement, which leaves the suburb still disadvantaged for its life into the long term. So I think because Fletchers seem to be struggling with its approach to developments, it is an opportunity for them to consider sale of that land, and for the government to see this as an opportunity in terms of its ambitions for urban development areas, and particularly this being a brownfield site instead of a greenfield site. It's very unusual that you get only a few landowners in one large area, just very unusual. And so it has an opportunity to be able to control the outcome in a way probably unmatched with other developments. And I would think likely to bring the community on its side if it went for the better outcome instead of building the Fletcher design. Thank you.
Questions from the floor?
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm Neville Pearce from Heikiang Orang and the Healthy Housing Research Group. I guess I was interested in energy efficiency and any look. Is there, so with Fletcher's covering so much ground and you're covering far less, potentials for photovoltaics and for renewable energy, have you?
Yes, we haven't gone into that further level of technical detail other than to say that we envisage all of these buildings having photovoltaics, except for one which would have a green roof, because we've lowered that so that people can look from this promontory across the development towards Big King. So to us, the idea of voltaics is actually beautiful because to us, it connects the energy from those buildings to the mountain, and rather than just to the sun. And so we're sort of getting a sense of power aligned with the landscape rather than just independently for the buildings themselves.
Would the, sorry, and I guess the other question is, would the different fill levels and yours being 7 meters higher, that'll probably make a big difference to the amount of sun you could get with the overshadowing tree kings?
We never raised overshadowing as the deeper fill level. We never raised shadowing as an effect because it's hard to sort of quantify what the effects of that will be. But nevertheless, I can say that our buildings being much higher, I won't say we'll have more sun access, but we don't see that as being a problem.
Thank you. I can see some architecture colleagues in the audience and town planners, so maybe they'd like to ask some questions.
I'm Libby Grant from the Centre for Sustainable Cities here at the university. Great, an interesting talk, Richard. I was thinking about the lower fill levels that Fletcher's had envisaged. What were the implications for climate change and increased flooding in Auckland? How would that, what would that be?
It's a very interesting question. There's an underlying complexity to the site. There's very high natural water levels. And the concern with Fletcher's development was that it was very close to the water table. And so it's had to put in, I've got a couple of slides here, had to put in soakage zones around the quarry so that water can drain quickly away from the surface because the fall of the fill level in their scheme is towards the buildings, not away. And this is considered technically fine. There's no technical problems with this. I guess my issue here is that you can see the areas in blue. It's really, it's about, to me, that the opportunity to use this to talk about the volcanic landscape has been lost. The water-sensitive design is focused on amenity around the apartment buildings and using the edge of the quarry for its drainage. Whereas I've taken the opposite view, is that I've got a much higher fill level, so I don't have the same flood risks as Fletcher, but I'm distributing stormwater towards the face of, or the base of Big King, and enhancing that landscape. So it's interesting that in every kind of facet of the developments, we're telling the same story in a different way. And that story in the Fletcher scheme, I guess, focuses on the development and on the quarry. And in my scheme, it focuses on the outcome for the volcano and the community. And that's quite a consistent difference. But that's in this case, that's one example that we've illustrated. And we think that we could use wastewater treatment in the same way.
We've got time for another 2 or 3 questions. Thank you. Just a minute. Otherwise, they can't hear off there.
Atura Bay, the landscape architect from PAOS. Yes, very interesting, Richard. I was wondering about, in your scheme, there's a lot of fill required and where that would come from.
Good question. We had evidence given by a civil engineer in the court, and as part of his analysis of the fill level required, he looked at, I guess, the supply of landfills around Auckland. And generally what he found was that there's a lot of small fill created by many sites, rather than looking towards one major development that will provide a substantial part of the fill. One of the landfill sites closest to here, called Greenmount, closed in 2016, and so he saw that the fill that was taken to that could be redistributed to Three Kings. Guess what's happening in Auckland? There is a significant amount of development now, and 70% of that is happening within the central area rather than outside the urban limits. And so whereas a lot of landfill sites are actually well outside the central area, Three Kings is unique in that it's very centrally located. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to say that that Fletchers have planned this development to unfold over a decade, over 10 years. So we don't see that as, we see the same kind of time frame for the whole of our development. It's not as though we're saying our development will be quicker. What the engineers found out is that it's about a year and 10 months longer, based upon the 2016 scheme by Fletcher. But the court has lifted the fill levels for Fletcher, so that difference is not as great as it once was. And I guess the way that I see it is that you've got the extra housing yield from our design, and you've got less infrastructure, and you've got less building, and you then weigh that against the extra time for fill, and does that still come out as a positive for our scheme? And in my opinion, I think it would, but obviously Fletcher might have a different view.
We have time for one more question.
I've got 2 questions. One is very...
Hera, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry, I'm Hera Cook in the Department of Public Health. I've got 2 questions. The first one is very prosaic. What about the shopping mall, the private owners? How do they feel about your design, and what's their response? And the other one is, I mean, this is obviously a very elegant design in terms of how it uses the landscape and it uses the resources. And it's using a brownfield site, and you're hoping it could be a site of special interest. Do you think there's any kind of more general lessons in terms of thinking about urban design that you could take from this example?
Okay, so the first question, the town centre is privately owned, and that has exchanged hands once since the Three Kings plan was created. And there doesn't appear to be any indication from the new landowner that they will develop that town centre in the short term. The unitary plan has upzoned the height limits on the town centre significantly, upwards of 8 stories. So there's immense potential there. I haven't talked to the new landowners because it was a contested process through the court. What I provided in a way is just a guide for how the town centre could be developed. What I'm keen for it to avoid is the building of towers, isolated towers. Rather, I would get the yield from lower floors, but consistently across that area, so that you're creating something that is very compact. So that's a future discussion, and that would be a discussion that the government would have with them if they were interested in pursuing Three Kings. The second question, in terms of what general kind of principles or learnings could we gain from this? I think, look, I've done a lot of transport planning, replanning, and what I find time and again with almost all of these projects, whether they're any large-scale project, there's an inability to be able to work in an integrated way with a place. And time and again, what developers, whether they're the transport agency or in this case Fletcher, they separate their development from their surroundings every single time. And so what we need to be able to develop are skills that can integrate complex land uses and land forms together. And I have to say there's not much evidence of that. I'd also say that the unitary plan, whilst it has unlocked a huge development potential for the city, has never really modelled what that potential looks like three-dimensionally. And so what I'm finding when I kind of zero in on particular sites is that there's no regard for what may be developed rather than, and then trying to actually plan for that rather than an ad hoc site-by-site process. So, and then the third thing I would say is really looking at something that a former urban design manager of Wellington City Council, who's worked with me on this, Jan McCready, said, and that is that we have to start looking at holistic outcomes, not on a site-by-site basis, and see that and look at the long term, not the short term, and so we've got low horizons at the moment, and we keep on missing opportunities in what are very special places.
Thank you. That's a very redolent note to end on, and I hope you agree with me that it's been a very interesting presentation. Sort of follows on well from our conference that we had 2 weeks ago, and thank you for presenting it here.
Thank you.